Hello and welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott. This is program number 1 in what will probably turn out to be a rather long series. We're going to be looking at the book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible. And this is going to be an introduction to that book. And the introduction is going to take up the whole of the first program, and then in the second program we'll start looking at the verses, chapter and verse all the way through. Now, the book of Revelation is one that I have not particularly cared for, frankly, because of the difficulty in interpretation and the many varying ways that it can be interpreted. And I'm going to close out the program with the 4 general views of how to interpret Revelation. But the last time, when I looked at back through my sermons, the last time I worked on the book of Revelation was 1987. That's been quite a while. And so I am glad to be back into it. I'm hoping that it will make some sense and be interesting to people. I'm going to try to do that. At the same time, I'm going to have to be very careful, and as I approach the material, to convey it to you as accurately as I can. Now, it's the last book in the Bible. Genesis, the first book, Revelation, the last book, and when you look at it, they're like bookends. I mean, really bookends. The Revelation perfectly completes the Bible. Particularly the last few chapters 19, 20, and they perfectly are a great ending to Genesis, the first 3 chapters. And they go hand in glove. What was begun in Genesis is fully completed in the book of Revelation. And many preachers have at least 1 or 2 sermons that deal with that particular issue. It is so evident that the bookend analogy really works. Now, in a way, the book of Revelation is quite simple to understand. It is only complicated because that some of the symbols are not exactly clear to us. I'm going to try in this program to bring a couple of those to our attention, and we will deal with them as we go along. But it employs what is called apocalyptic language. In the Greek, the Greek word we have is the apocalypse. The apocalypse. It doesn't mean that which is hidden, it means to reveal. Yes, the book of Revelation is just what it is, to reveal. It's a revealing. And the words that have often used for it is the apocalypse, just means the revelation, the revealing. It's not intended to be hidden. Now, apocalyptic language we find in other places in the Old Testament. For example, we find it in Daniel, we find it in Ezekiel, we find it in Zechariah. Now that kind of language, this kind of writing in code, was developed after what was called the period of the exile, E-X-I-L-E. That is when the 2 southern tribes of Judah were overwhelmed by the Babylonians, and they were dispersed throughout the Mediterranean world. And here they found themselves in foreign lands, and their hope was to keep their religion alive. And they would often resort to, in their writings, even in their speech, to this kind of code language that we call apocalyptic. And if you knew the meaning, you could readily understand what was being said, whereas others probably would not. The trouble is, in the years between now and then, we have lost a lot of the means to understand the symbols and the codes. We know a lot of it, and there are places that I will admit that I don't know, and I couldn't find a reliable commentator to present their view, and everybody's got lots of views on this stuff. but it is a revelation. And that is what we want to keep in mind. So now some of the code words. Numbers are a big deal. Numbers in the book of Revelation. The number 3, for instance, generally means a short time. The number 3.5 will mean a little bit longer than a short time, unspecified. The 3 doesn't necessarily mean 3. 3.5 doesn't necessarily mean 3.5. In fact, you can almost be sure that when you find a number, you cannot take it literally. See, what happened in interpretation of the book of Revelation is the same difference between the Hebrew mindset and the Western mindset. The Semitic or the Hebrew mindset uses the symbols and does not take them literally. The Western mindset takes things literally. And so much, the recent history of Christianity has so often been dominated by the Western mindset with the tendency to take everything in a literal way. I like to say if it says 3, it doesn't mean 3. If it says 1,000, it doesn't mean 1,000. If it says 144,000, it doesn't mean 144,000. The numbers have a code meaning. 7 is another number we find a lot of in the book of Revelation. In fact, in my view, the book of Revelation can be broken down into 7 different segments by which it is proclaimed that Jesus Christ and his church are conquerors and win the battle. 7 different times, not necessarily in equal length. That's one way of looking at the book of Revelation, and one is a way that I'm going to use to some degree in this study. But 7 is a number that means completion, perfection, maturity, finality. The number 10 and 12 are used in the same way. Completeness, fullness, totality. And then multiples of those numbers. For example, we're going to come across the 12,000 of each of the tribes of Israel. 12,000, number of 12,000. Well, that's 12 times 1,000. 1,000 is 10 cubed, 10 times 10 times 10. And then you have 144,000, which is 12 times 12,000, or 12 squared times 1,000. And this was part of what it meant to have the use of apocalyptic or code language that was hidden to people unless they understood the significance of the numbers. The book of Revelation starts out with 7 letters to the churches of Asia, and we're going to try to get that map up right now. And we're going to see this map from time to time. If you don't see it right away, you're going to see it eventually. But the letters, the book of Revelation, were written to 7 churches that were in the western part of modern-day Turkey. Then was called Asia, the 7 churches of Asia. But really they were letters written to all the churches. We find that pretty easily as you go through the book of Revelation. So it's a series of revelations, of visions, not to be taken literally, but they're visions that God gives to John. And we'll get to that a little more clearly when we get into the chapter 1, verse 1. I want to talk a little bit about the author, but I also want to mention before I do that one of the ways of misunderstanding the book of Revelation is to make it all seem to have to do with the United States and the United Kingdom. And why that is so is a little bit mystifying, but that's only happened, of course, in more recent centuries. But the revelation, the visions that John receives, are for all the church. And when you begin to take a look at summaries of ideas that focus on the United States and the United Kingdom, it gets a little bit hilarious at times and obviously contrived, but I just want to mention that we're not going to approach the book of Revelation in that way, that it has to do with events, contemporary events, having to do with the United States and the United Kingdom. Now the author. Who is the author? The author is the same one who authored the Gospel of John and wrote the three letters we call 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. He is the beloved disciple whose brother was James, mother was Salome, and Jesus and John were cousins, because Salome, John's mother, was Mary the Virgin, the mother of Jesus' sister. They were sisters. So here we have cousins. And he was a young man when he was a follower of Jesus. He was the one to whom Jesus gave the care of his mother to. Remember, at the cross, John was the only disciple to come to the cross. And while on the cross, Jesus said, "Behold thy mother," he said to John. And John took her and cared for her for the rest of her life. And they eventually, legend tells us, and pretty reliable legend at that, John took her to the city of Ephesus, one of the 7 churches of Asia, and that's where John lived with Mary and cared for her until her death. He was exiled to a small island called Patmos, Patmos, from Ephesus, where he was, and he escaped being executed probably because of how well known he was, and the fact that they probably couldn't find anything that was too awful bad about this elderly gentleman at that point. And so he was exiled, which was a Roman custom, like many have done. The French remember Devil's Island, if you saw the film Papillon, and starring Steve McQueen and I think it was Dustin Hoffman, and they were exiled to Devil's Island. Well, that is an ancient practice, and I've actually been to the island of Patmos and been able to go to what is thought to have been the little cave or grotto where John wrote the book of Revelation. Whether or not that's true, we don't know, but it seems probable to me. That small island, beautiful harbor, and there it is in the highest point. You find this rocky cave in which John is supposed to have written this book. The book of Revelation is the only book in the Bible. Some people might quibble with this, and that's okay. This may not be totally accurate, but it appears to me it's the only book in the Bible where the author knew that what he was writing was inspired. The book of Revelation is completely different than any other New Testament book. It bears some resemblance to some of the prophetic books, but I came across this. I might have even thought it myself, but I think commentator said it's the only book where the author knew what he was writing was inspired material. The book was written in the last decade of the first century, someplace between about 95 and 98 AD, AD 95 to 98. That is probably roughly the time period in which the book was written. Now, the purpose of the book of Revelation, the purpose was to comfort and encourage a persecuted church that were being attacked by all all manner of things. The church was now a religio illicita. They were illegal. Christianity was not recognized by Rome. For a while it existed kind of under the broader umbrella of Judaism, but when it became clear that Christianity was something different, it lost that protection of being a legal religion as Judaism was. And not only that, there were the period of the Gnostics, among a few other groups that had really challenging Christianity by having a religion that sort of incorporated the Christian terminology and some of the imagery and some of the stories of Christianity, and made for real confusion. And then there was emperor worship. And we're going to talk about Tiberius just a little bit. Tiberius was an emperor who had statues made of himself, and they would be taken by Roman soldiers, little groups of Roman soldiers, all over the Roman Empire, and including where the 7 churches of Asia were. And everybody was required to line up and offer sacrifices to the statue of Tiberius. And Tiberius referred to himself as Augustus, excuse me, I got to look it up. I got to get it right. Lord, God, and Savior. Tiberius Soter, S-O-T-E-R, which is Greek for Savior. And people would have to bring offerings, some kind of sacrifice, maybe food, fruit, whatever. But they'd have to swear allegiance to Tiberius. If they refused, the Christians were subject to arrest, confiscation of their property, economic boycott, and death. So they were confronted with that. Then, lastly, they were confronted about the ubiquitous pagan culture they lived in. It was very much given to idols. It was idol worship. It was a great deal of the occult that was infused into that culture. It was a magical, spiritistic, fortune-telling kind of an environment. There were constant festivals honoring the gods and the goddesses, and they were very gross in their nature. And so you had all of this combination of things that was going on. And the book of Revelation is written to a church that is virtually under siege, a persecuted church. And it's also a book that is written to wake up the Christians. Now, this is some 40 years. The church has been around, let me see, not 40 years. How did I come up with that? About 60 years, since 60, 70 years after the crucifixion. So you've got almost a third generation. And you can see as we look at the letters, like the church at Sardis was just gradually becoming lazy. They were becoming apathetic. They had imbibed the culture too much. And their faith was being compromised by just the culture around them. They started to embrace too much of it. And so this is the world in which the letter of Revelation was written. And it was right. The main theme of the book of Revelation is that Jesus Christ is victor and Lord, and the church shares in that victor, and that the dragon or Satan and his helpers will be defeated. That is the essential message of the book of Revelation. Domitian was the emperor at this particular time, AD 81 to 96, when the first real empire-wide persecution took place. under the emperorship of Domitian. And so we see from a number of reasons a general decline in the churches, which, interestingly enough, is very typical of what happens to Christianity. Christianity is interesting, and it doesn't make any difference at time, but there'll be times of great awakening and then times of decline. And the church almost looks like it's over. And then there's a great awakening, and God gives a great revivals, and taking place not all over the world at the same time, but in different places. So it's always like this. It's always the roller coaster kind of effect. And this book was written when there had been a steep decline in the church, in their faith, in their zeal, and so on. So this is what happened to the Christians during that period. They faced all of these difficult means that was very present in their world. Now, I would like to mention 4 major ways of understanding the book of Revelation. 4 ways of doing it, and I'm going to take a chance on mentioning mine. It's going to be number 4, the way I look at it, but actually I have at different times embraced all of these. But the 3rd and the 4th were the ones that I embraced the most and the longest. So we're going to get to that. But first I want to get with the first way that the church has understood the book of Revelation. It's called preterist, P-R-E-T-E-R-I-S-T, preterist. Now, here's what it means, and I tell you, the explanations of these can be very lengthy. I'm just going to give you a short one. You might want to consult other materials for further explanations, but here's what I have. That all of the book of Revelation would be unfolded in the very first century, or most of it. Primarily, this is linked to a position called post-millennialism. Post-millennialism. That's the preterist. The second is called the historical. The historical means that the predictions of the book of Revelation are in the process of being fulfilled. Also, this is a post-millennial position, and it just, as the book goes along, that we see that it's being fulfilled. The third one, and one that really I started out with as a young Christian, called the futurist, where all predictions are in the future. After you get to chapter 4, after the letters to the 7 churches, in chapter 4, it begins the first of the major visions, and they are yet to be fulfilled. They will only be fulfilled toward the very last days. And I would suspect that most, at least evangelical, Pentecostal, charismatic Christians have a futuristic view of the book of Revelation, that it's happening in the future. And as I said, I embraced this early on where I was going to church. This was our pastor's view, and of course I didn't know there were other views. I never heard about those, and I embraced what I heard. And one of the things that I find that is important for Christians is to see maybe what some other views are. No one really knows, because the Bible doesn't say exactly how the book of Revelation is to be interpreted. And my means of looking at it is the fourth, one that I have embraced, let's say, for maybe the last 15 or 20 years, is called the spiritual or the idealist. The idealist point of view. That the events described are symbols of the church throughout the ages. without a literal or an historical fulfillment. It's just what the church experiences as the centuries roll on. So that's how I look at the book of Revelation. There are parts of it that have not yet been fulfilled. That's true enough. You'll see when we get to the latter chapters of Revelation, we'll find that there are events yet to take place, according to most commentators. Again, my goal is not so much to give you a position. Frankly, in our church that I pastor, there's going to be preterists, there's going to be the historical, the futurist, and the idealist. And probably the idealist is probably the minimal view in the church I pastor. It really doesn't make that great of difference, and I'm not trying to pass on any viewpoint. I want people to see what is in the book. It's a simple book, relatively easy to understand once you get to see the overall message of the book, which is the defeat of Satan and the victory of Christ and the church. Now, at the very beginning, I mentioned that Genesis is the first bookend and Revelation the last bookend, that they make, it's just a complete whole. You see how the Bible is this complete whole, Genesis to Revelation. And the whole key of the Bible and the summary passage of the Bible is found in the oldest strata of literature in the Bible, and that is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. I want to read that to you because it has the whole of the story. Here it is, Genesis 3:15. This is God's judgment upon the serpent or Satan. Here's what it is. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. What a difference. A head wound as opposed to a small heel wound. The offspring of the woman will deliver that death blow to Satan himself. And essentially, that's what the book of Revelation is all about. So long.